Welcome, everyone. If we haven't met yet, my name is Scott Newman. I am the associate pastor here at Santa Cruz Bible, and we just want to say happy Memorial Day weekend to you all. Thanks for coming out, and we're grateful to see those of you in the room, and we want to extend a special welcome right now if you're watching online or on demand at a later point in time. We are continuing a series this morning that Matt kicked off for us last week that we're calling The Way, where we're talking about Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5 through 7, which is really kind of the essence of what Jesus came to do and to say and what he was about. It's an invitation to the kind of life that he invites all of us into. And so whether you are familiar with the Sermon on the Mount or whether this is kind of your first introduction, we want to invite you to read the Sermon on the Mount with us this summer. This is a great 3 chapters of the Bible to spend time really reading and studying and soaking in through this summer, and it will really richly repay all of the time that you spend in it. So as we continue this morning, I had an interesting experience this week. On Monday, I took my oldest son, Elijah, to soccer tryouts. So he's playing club soccer now with Santa Cruz Breakers, and it's his first tryout, and so he was super nervous going into it. I could, just feed off the nervous energy coming off of him. And of course, all the kids out there were nervous, and I was talking to some of the other parents out there, and we were reminiscing about our time playing competitive sports in high school and things like that. And how nervous we would get before tryouts and games and things. So I played football in high school. I know I don't look like it now, but I played football. And before games, I would just get so nervous. Like I would almost throw up. I was so nervous. And really, I wasn't alone. Most of us on the team were like that. And so we developed these ways of managing our anxiety. We had our routines and our rituals and stuff like that. It was like if we wear the same shirt and we unpack our bags the same way, then, the game will go well. But so much of the anxiety stemmed from this sense of pressure that we all felt. I mean, we had friends, family members, potential girlfriends coming to watch us, play, and we wanted to do well and show off. And then our coaches that had spent the week yelling at us to do better, we wanted to please them, and ultimately we wanted to win. And so there was all of this pressure to do well, leading to this sense of anxiety. And even if you didn't play competitive sports at any point in your life, I'm sure you know this kind of pressure that I'm talking about. Because we experience it in our work lives and in our family lives, in our friend groups, in our hobbies. There's this pressure to perform that oftentimes comes along with life. And it gets transferred not just into our everyday life kinds of things, but oftentimes that same pressure gets transferred into our spiritual lives as well. We can feel a lot of pressure to do the right thing, or at least whatever we believe is the right thing, even when it doesn't sometimes feel normal or natural or safe. So when we turn to the Sermon on the Mount, which, if we're honest this morning, which we're going to be, is really, really, really challenging, there's a sense of pressure or maybe even full-blown panic that can sometimes set in for us. And then when you add on to it the fact that Jesus is inviting us into a way of life that isn't just about ourselves, but it's a way of life that is also for the sake of others. It's for the life of the world. That kind of pressure can feel crushing. I mean, who am I to live in any kind of way for the sake of others, right? But remember, Jesus came to bring us good news. He came to bring us life, not condemnation. He came to lighten our loads, not tie us up with heavy burdens. So what I hope we can see as we move through this next section of Jesus' sermon this morning is that Jesus does not put pressure on us. Jesus doesn't put pressure on us. What he's doing is as we'll see this morning, he's describing what life looks like when we are so united to God's own life, caught up into God's own life, that it's God's life that shines through us as we live. And so it's God's life in us for the sake of the world that frees us from any pressure that we might feel to perform. All right? So let's dive in. Matt kicked us off last week with what's called the Beatitudes, these 9 blessings that Jesus pronounces. And then Jesus continues his sermon this morning with a passage that's probably well known to most, if not all of us. So we're looking at Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 13 to 16. So read along with me on the screen. Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." So what's going on here? Jesus is using salt and light as sort of metaphors to describe our calling as God's people. So the question is, why salt and light? What's so special about salt and light? Well, let's start with salt. Salt is both a seasoning and a preservative, right? So you got a bland beef patty in front of you, throw some salt on that bad boy, and life's going to get way better. It's like a party in your mouth, right? Or how about some starchy potatoes, right? Super bland. Throw some salt, maybe a little oil, garlic, right, in there, and you've got one of the world's best treats. So some might say, well, now we know medically, right, that too much salt is a bad thing. And as a result, some restaurants are trying to use less salt in their ingredients. They advertise as fresh and things like that. But what happens when you don't have enough salt? Well, just ask Chipotle. So when the ingredients, especially the meat, aren't preserved well enough, you're going to be getting more than just a side of chips with your meal, if you know what I mean. And you don't want that. So all that to say is that salt makes life better. It makes life more interesting. It means that you can enjoy things for longer. Now, what about light? Well, this seems like super obvious, right? But light is what makes sight possible. Without light, we can't enjoy the beautiful colors of a spring day or the, nice gray of a Santa Cruz morning, right? We can't enjoy the beautiful views out on East Cliff or West Cliff. But not only would life without light be a lot more difficult or dull, it would be a lot more dangerous. I mean, imagine the kind of trouble you could get into going about your day without seeing. I mean, just spend an hour or so closing your eyes trying to do your normal tasks, and you might end up injured. So please don't go home and do that. So the church will not be held responsible for that. Or imagine driving at night without headlights or street lights. That would be a recipe for disaster. No insurance companies would insure you because it's not going to end well. It's just not. So the point of salt and light is that they are beneficial. Salt preserves things and it seasons, while light makes things clear. And without those things, life would be a lot less interesting and we'd all be in a lot of trouble. So in fact, the ancient Roman historian Pliny talked about this. He said, "To the whole body, nothing is better than sun and salt." So all the way back in human history, people talked about how sun and salt, or light and salt, were these things that were so essential to life and to enjoying life. And Jesus here takes up these metaphors. But why? Why is Jesus talking about salt and light? Well, these two images, they give us a sense of what our calling is as God's people. So what is our calling? Well, it's to be salt and light. Okay, well, what does that mean? So if we dig back into the scriptures, we get a picture of this in the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew prophets talked about how God regularly uses this image of light to help us understand what our calling or what our mission is as God's people. So, for example, listen to how the prophet Isaiah talks about this, or God through the prophet Isaiah talks about this in Isaiah 42, 6 and 7. It says, I, the Lord, have called you, Israel, in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles, to open eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison, and to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. So being salt and being light is a part of God's work to release people from physical and spiritual oppression. It's also God's calling to release people from ignorance and brokenness. It's not being light if those things aren't happening. And then look again, another place where God talks about our calling in terms of light. Isaiah chapter 60, verses 1 to 3. It says, Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. See, darkness covers the earth, and thick darkness is over the peoples. But the Lord rises upon you, and his glory appears over you. Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. So what this passage tells us is that the light of God's people is, or at least it should be, attractive. It's something that people want to be in. It's not something that pushes them away. It's something that draws them in. Okay? So then the question is, if this is the calling of God's people, both the nation of Israel in the Old Testament and us today, those who are followers of Jesus, how do we be salt and light? And this is where things get really interesting. Because Jesus himself tells us in verse 16 of Matthew chapter 5 from our passage this morning, I'll read it again. He says, In the same way, let your light shine before others that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Well, how do we be salt and light? Jesus says it happens when we do good deeds or good works. And the idea is that as people see us living this way, it leads them to recognize who God is. But if you've spent any time around church, this is where things start to feel like pressure. Anytime we start talking about good works or good deeds, it feels like pressure. I'll be honest, it feels like pressure to me. I don't know if I'm alone in that. But let's be honest, there is a lot of performative stuff that we as Christians do in the name of being salt and light. And if we're honest, a lot of it ends up being pretty cringy. So, back when I was in youth group, and why do these stories always come from youth group? We used to do this thing every September called See You at the Pole. Not that pole. Get your mind out of the gutter. It was where all the Christians and kids at the middle school would gather at the school's flag pole, that's the pole we're talking about, before school and pray for their school and their friends. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. Obviously, it's great to pray for your school, pray for your friends, but why do we need to do it standing in a circle around a flagpole looking all culty-like, right? Now, it definitely made us stand out. I mean, you could hear the people talking about what's going on, what's happening, all of that as they were walking past us into the school. But I'm not convinced it made Jesus look attractive to anyone. And why you can't pray for your friends and the school silently as you're walking from class to class is beyond me. So, I don't know. We had to do it by the flagpole. It was performative. So, here's another one. When I was in junior high, my youth pastor printed up a bunch of shirts that said, if you died tonight, where would you go? And the idea was that you get kids thinking about their mortality, because every 13-year-old is thinking about their death, am I right? And if they get scared enough, they might ask you about the bad place and the good place, and you might have a chance to talk to them about Jesus. Well, guess what happened? I wore that shirt a whole bunch because I was that kid, and no one ever asked me about it, at least not in a serious way, although I did get made fun of it quite a bit, which was okay because my 13-year-old brain interpreted this as like, oh, this is what Jesus talks about when we, getting persecuted for righteousness' sake, so I'm good. Which is not what getting persecuted for righteousness' sake is. Again, the problem is it's not attractive. There's nothing attractive about that, and it's not even good news. Or how about this one from more recently? There was, if my iPad can start working. There we go. How about this one from more recently? A few weeks ago, a Christian influencer and worship leader decides to get a bunch of Christians together at a mall for an impromptu worship concert. Do they have a permit for this? Well, no. But surely they got permission from someone, right? Also, no. So you can imagine what happens next. They get kicked out. And instead of going home and rethinking their missional strategy, saying, I think we've gone off the rails at some point along here, they decide to march around the mall, walls of Jericho style, if you know what I'm talking about from the Old Testament, while singing and making TikToks about how they're being persecuted for their faith. That's not being persecuted for your faith or righteousness' sake. That's being persecuted for stupidity's sake. So I got to be honest, that's not salt and light. It's not attractive, and it's not releasing people from injustice and ignorance and brokenness. Now, these are kind of extreme examples, but there's a lot of pressure that we sometimes feel to be performative in our faith. We got to do these good deeds, these nice things, these things for people to see us. Otherwise, we're not doing it right. And it leads to, honestly, when I read this passage, an uneasiness in my gut. I get a sense that somehow I'm not doing enough. There's a lingering question in the back of my mind about whether or not I'm doing enough to be seen so that people can see God for who God is. Can anyone else relate to this pressure, or is it just me? Okay. The good news is that when we return to Jesus' words, he actually takes that pressure off of us. Jesus doesn't tell us in the passage we read this morning that we have to try really, really, really hard, and then we might be able to pull off a few good moments of being salt or light. He doesn't tell us to get our act together and be salt or light, and if we don't, there's a whole bunch of people that are going to be lost because of it. No. What does Jesus say? He says, you are the salt of the earth. He says, you are the light of the world. This isn't something that you and I have to try hard to be. In Jesus, we're already salt and light. Well, how does that work? Again, last week, Matt talked about what are called the Beatitudes, these 9 statements of blessing that Jesus pronounces on those listening to him. Things like being poor in spirit and humble and hungering and thirsting for righteousness and justice and peacemaking and mourning. And this is not like a super happy list of things, but these are things that are very, very, very much a part of the human experience. And at root, these are things that describe God's own life. God is humble. God is poor in spirit. God hungers and thirsts for righteousness. God is a peacemaker. And so Jesus is blessing those who hear this teaching and who follow him with the gift of God's own life in us. You, right now, have God's own life present in you. And it's not like a flashlight that you have to toggle on and off. It's just there with you when you're going about your day, when you're doing very normal things, when you're at work and when you're with your family and when you're with your friends and when you're doing your hobbies. It's just there. And so when we go about our normal lives carrying the presence of God with us, we are salt and light without having to do anything special to activate it. So trust me, you don't have to stand around a flagpole or walk around a mall to be salt and light and stand out. Humility, peacemaking, poverty, the willingness to look grief and injustice in the face, hungering for justice, having pure motives, being willing to be called out and pay a price for it for the sake of justice and righteousness. These are things that stand out in our world. These aren't popular things, but they do stand out, and ultimately, they are attractive because it connects with something deep in the life and the heart of every single human being. And it's in living out these realities of God's own life that makes God visible to people in a way that shows our communities just how attractive God is. That's what it means for people to see our good works and glorify God. It doesn't mean they need to break out into some, worship song or a prayer of biblical proportions or start speaking in tongues or whatever it is. It's just recognizing God's love and compassion and goodness and beauty and truth for what it is. And so this way of living, God's life in us, is attractive to people. It makes the world a better place. Makes the world more like God's kingdom. And then when people see that in you as an individual and in us as a community, the church, trying to follow Jesus, you'll get asked about it. People will say, why are you as Christians working for justice? Why are you as Christians trying to bring, different people together, being peacemakers? Why are you trying to find God's presence amongst the poor and the broken and the hurting and the marginal in the world? Why are you as Christians standing up for what's right when everyone else wants to go a different way? You'll get asked about it. And you have the opportunities to point people to Jesus, to the source of our life. And so this follows a pattern that we see in the Bible over and over and over again, that whenever God blesses a person or a group, it's always so that they in turn can bless others. In the Hebrew Scriptures, Abraham, who was the forefather of the nation of Israel and the Jewish people, it says that God blessed him and that through him and his family, every single nation of the earth would be blessed. And so whatever blessing you read about for Israel in the Hebrew Scriptures was never intended to be just for them. It was always intended to be for all of us as well. So there's a really cool picture of how this works in the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah is writing to the Jewish people who had been conquered and carried off into exile by the Babylonian Empire. And so the people of Israel, many of them, find themselves in exile, living in a foreign land, a place that feels very foreign and unfamiliar and hostile towards them. And Jeremiah, the prophet, writes them a letter on behalf of God, giving them instructions about how they're to live during this 70-year period of exile. So listen to what Jeremiah says this is supposed to look like, God's encouragement to them as they're living in this way. Jeremiah 29, verses 4-7. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. So God doesn't tell the people of Israel, those people that conquered you and enslaved you and carried them off into exile, you need to be subversive and work for their destruction, and maybe one day you'll conquer them and beat them down. God tells them no. Very ordinary kinds of things. Work your way into the life of this culture. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city. Own businesses. Intermarry. Have kids. Increase in number. Pray for them. Don't have this adversarial relationship with them. And this is how God calls us as his people to live in the places where we find ourselves. It's too easy for many Christians to look at the community around us in Santa Cruz and to feel very adversarial, or even to feel under siege. I know a lot of people have felt like that as Christians living in a progressive community like Santa Cruz. But God calls us to love and to serve our community. We're called to love and serve Santa Cruz as it is, not as we would have Santa Cruz be. Because it's God's life in us for the life of the world that will be salt and light, that will be seasoning, that will be preservative, that will bring clarity and vision and understanding. We don't have to do these crazy special things. As a church, we're going to continue to be an outpost here on our campus and have our food pantries and be involved in ways in the community, but we're not going to do it in ways that feel cringy or feel forced or feel awkward. We're going to live life with our neighbors. We're going to carry the presence of God with us, and that will invite our neighbors into something special and something different, but also something extremely ordinary as well. We don't have to put all of this pressure on ourselves to do these big things. God says, just like he says to Israel, build houses, settle down, plant gardens, eat what they produce, marry and have kids, increase in number, seek the peace and prosperity of Santa Cruz. Pray to the Lord for Santa Cruz, because when Santa Cruz prospers, you will prosper. So what this invites us to is to cultivate and tend to God's growing life in us. If there's a takeaway from what we're called to do this morning, it's not that we need to go out and do these big grand gestures. We need to tend to God's growing life in us. We need to take time to recognize the reality of how God's life, these blessings, these beatitudes are working their way into our everyday experience. To see God and his love and his grace and his compassion meet us, not in the moments when we're doing great and feeling good about ourselves and feeling like we're spiritually strong, but to meet us in the moments when we're struggling, when we're down, when it feels like life is beating us up. That's the place where Jesus meets us and wants to do deep inner work of healing and transformation for you and for me. And when we can, instead of just sort of bearing down and buckling down and gritting our teeth and pressing through it, we can sort of relax and receive the gift of God's love and his life and his presence in those moments. Your life will slowly but surely begin to take on more of the character of God's own life in you for the sake of the world. Would you pray with me? Jesus, we confess that so often we put tons of pressure on ourselves to do things in a way that would seem to make sense. It seems to make sense to want to do these big and great things and want to make a splash and want to be seen and want to stand out. But you invite us to something that really is very ordinary and normal. But you take the pressure off because we don't have to do these big things. We actually don't even have to do anything different. We just carry your life with us. And so for those who feel burdened and weighed down and under pressure, I pray that you would release that sense of burden. Would you grant them the awareness of your life in them, that they are already right now salt and light, that they are already right now your beloved son, your beloved daughter. And as we carry this life with us this week, would you surprise us with the opportunities that we have to talk about you? Would you surprise us with the opportunities that we have to acknowledge that our true identity doesn't come from our work or from our money or from our relationships, but our true identity stems from you and what you have made us in your Son, Jesus. And so, Jesus, we know that this isn't something we can accomplish, but through us, you can accomplish all of these things to bring love and healing and wholeness to this community of Santa Cruz that we love so much. And so, Jesus, for all these things, we love you and we trust you and we pray them in your name. Amen.